Good morning. Thank you everybody for being here, and thank you Professor Hoppe for the invitation. As always, it is a pleasure and an honor to be here. The topic of my talk today is very topical and something that is in the news a lot these days. It's different from my usual topics on economics and monetary policy and Bitcoin. I'm going to be talking about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, something that I have lived and experienced vividly throughout my life. And I'm going to explain it and propose the idea that it is basically a conflict that can be understood through the lens of property rights. It's essentially a conflict of property rights. And the reason for that is that if you think about how the conflict has happened over the years, ultimately the best frame for understanding it is through the understanding of the problem of property rights. Quite simply, in 1947 and 1948, the centuries-old or millennia-old system of property rights that has existed in Palestine was destroyed and instead replaced with a government agency that owns the vast majority of the property and only assigns it to people by lease based on racial and ethnic criteria. This is the key thing. And this is something that would create violent conflict anywhere in the world. If you tried to do this anywhere, where you just said, all of the property rights here are canceled, everybody who owns something doesn't own it anymore, all of the property goes to the government, and now the government assigns that property based on considerations of race and ethnicity, you would get conflict. So there's nothing really unique about the Palestinian-Israeli conflict or about that part of the world. It's just the same thing that I would expect to see as an Austrian, as an economist. This is what you see. If you deny property rights, you're going to get conflict. Next, please. So to explain this, let's look back in 1945, when under British mandate, the British authorities conducted a survey of the land and the population of Palestine, and they found in 1945 that the property in Palestine that was owned by Jewish people was about 5.67% of the total land of Palestine. That's it. About 48.3% was owned by Muslims, Christians, and people who are not Jewish. And 46% was essentially public property, but most of it is in the south. It's desert. It was practically and de jure owned, and de facto it was owned by the Bedouins who used it to graze their cattle. But among the privately owned land, if you look at the map of Palestine, the south is all desert. That's the part that was mostly public property. But the north, half of the country roughly in the north is mostly privately owned. And among the privately owned land, only 10.5% was owned by Jews and about 89.5% was owned by non-Jews. This was the situation in Palestine in 1945. Next, please. And this is the map that was produced by this survey in 1945, which shows us every single district. The south, the bottom one, as you see, the white area is the public land. So the majority of the bottom half of the country was public land, but de facto owned by the Bedouins who lived there, nomadic Bedouins. But the rest of the country, as you can see, the green parts of that slide show us the land that was owned by people who are not Jewish, which is essentially the vast majority. As you can see, in every single district, the majority of the land was owned by Muslims or Christians or Druze or people who are not Jewish. And the Jewish ownership, as you can see, is only the red parts, which is concentrated in the coast and in the northern areas, but not in any single district was it a majority. So this was the situation in 1945. Next, please. Next. And this was, after 30 years almost of the British mandate declaring that Palestine needs to be turned into a Jewish homeland with the Balfour Declaration, which came in 1917. So in 1917, when the British government decided that Palestine needs to become a Jewish homeland, the population of Palestine was about only 10% Jewish. The numbers are differing. The census at that time put it at about 5%, but there were a lot of illegal immigrants who weren't registered in the census, so some people claim it was as high as 14%. Somewhere between 5 and 14 is the number, but roughly we could say about 10% in 1917. 10% of the population was Jewish in 1917 when the British government decided by the decision of its cabinet that this place needs to become a national homeland for Jews. By 1948, thanks to 30 years of illegal immigration, the Jewish population of Palestine had increased significantly, but it had only gotten to 31%. So you're talking about 31% of the population owning less than 6% of the land. That was the situation in 1948. And so if you look at any part of the world where you have 30% of the population on 6% of the land, and you try to turn that into an ethno-state, a national homeland for that minority, that is 10 to 30% of the population and 6% of the land, it's going to create conflict, because you can't turn something into a national homeland without compromising the rights of the individuals who live there. Next, please. And this is, of course, it was very well understood by the leaders of the Zionist movement. So David Ben-Gurion, who was the first prime minister of Israel, he was very clear about this from the 1930s. There are several quotes in his own correspondences, in his letters, in his public speeches. They were very clear about the idea, this is a land that has already people inside it. And if we want to make it our land, we need to get our people from abroad. We need to get foreigners to come here, and we need to kick the people that are here outside. And that's just not something that usually can be done peacefully. You can't tell people to leave peacefully from their homes and give up all of their property. Human beings don't like to do that. History shows people like to own their property. People like to remain around their family, on their land, next to the remains of their ancestors. And they like to give that land to their children. That's what every civilization on earth wants to do. But the Israelis were very clear about this. This is not going to be done easily, and we need to use a military technique to it. We're going to use terror, assassination, intimidation, land confiscation. They understood it. Ben-Gurion was saying in the second quote, the country is theirs because they inhabit it, whereas we want to come here and settle down, and we want to take away from them their country. It is very clear what is going on. The numbers show it very clearly, and this would be the same pretty much anywhere. Next, please. So what happened then? How could you facilitate that? Well, the first thing is the British. The British, under the British mandate, they allowed the Zionist movement to build its terrorist infrastructure. So there were several terrorist Zionist organizations during the 1930s. They were allowed to get arms from abroad. They were allowed to build their militias, whereas the Palestinians were disarmed. That's the first thing that the British did. And this was, explicit British policy from 1917. In the official Balfour Declaration, Lord Balfour said we want to establish this national homeland knowing that it won't infringe on the rights of the local inhabitants who are not Jewish in the land. But a year later, after the Balfour Declaration, in a letter to Lloyd George, same person, Lord Balfour said, we are committed to Zionism, and Zionism, be it right or wrong, is far more important than the needs and prejudices and the property and the lives of the non-Jewish people who exist in that land. So it was always very clear that they needed to implement this regardless of the cost that is going to be enacted against the local population. And that's why in 1936 to 1939, when Palestinians rose up against the British mandate because they understood what was going on, because it was already very clear what the Zionist movement was going to achieve, the British disarmed the Palestinians. The 3-year intifada, 3-year uprising, was the largest anti-colonial uprising in the interwar period. They disarmed the Palestinians, but they kept the arms of the Zionist movement. And they kept on building their military capabilities throughout the 30s and 40s, even as they began to use extensive terror. And this was the first use of the terror in the Middle East. The Zionist movement, they bombed the hotels. They bombed, the most famous one is King David Hotel. They were using terrorism with the intention of scaring civilians so that the civilians would leave. And Menachem Begin, one of Israel's prime ministers, an interviewer asked him, how does it feel to be the person who invented terrorism in the Middle East? And he said, the Middle East, we invented political terrorism for the whole world. And he took pride in it. So the fact that the Zionist movement had a military wing, whereas the Palestinians were disarmed, meant that by the 1940s, the Israelis began a process of ethnically cleansing the Palestinians, who were essentially defenseless and helpless at that time. And that was done under something called the Plan Dalet. And that was an extensive plan for ensuring territorial contiguity between the small settlements, the 5.6% of the land. In order to try and connect it with each other, they looked at the map, they found all of the areas where Palestinian villages and towns and population concentrations existed, and they needed to expel them so that they would have territorial contiguity between their territories. And so before Israel declared its independence on May 15, 1948, Before that day, already about 250 to 300,000 Palestinians had been expelled from their homes. Systematic expulsions where they would walk into a village, expel, they would walk into a village, murder the people in a village, and then go around telling the other villages, if you don't leave, the same thing is going to happen to you. So about 300,000 people had already been expelled by May 15, 1948. Now, usually the official Israeli propaganda line here is that Israel was just an innocent country trying to declare its independence, but all these crazy neighbors of theirs attacked them for no conceivable reason whatsoever. Israel had to defend itself, and then magically a miracle happened and 800,000 Palestinians left. Of course, that's not true. People don't just miraculously leave their home. In fact, it was Weizmann, the first Israeli president, who literally said a miracle happened and they left about the Palestinians. But what was happening is that they were being expelled, and 300,000 were already expelled, and they were going to expel many more unless, and the Arab armies intervened to stop that expulsion after it had already begun. But they managed to only stop the expulsion from the West Bank and Gaza, but about half of the population of Palestine, half of the Palestinians were expelled. About 800,000 Palestinians were expelled in 1947 to 1949. Around more than 500 villages were depopulated, completely emptied of their inhabitants. Many of the cities and the neighborhoods of the cities were completely eradicated and expelled. And all of the property there was stolen. It was taken away from its rightful owners and given to the state of Israel. Next, please. So what the state of Israel imposed then was something called the absentee law for absentee property. And so if you were expelled at gunpoint, then you were an absentee, and now your property belongs to the state. Now, an interesting thing here is that some of the people who were expelled from their villages, they would have left the village, but they would have moved, say, to a city and remained in Israel. And then eventually they became Israeli citizens. About 20% of the population of Israel today are of these remaining Palestinians. They couldn't manage to expel all of the Palestinians at that point. So some of them remained there. And even the ones that remained there, they can't go back to their property, even though it could be 10 kilometers away. And they were given the title present absentees. So yes, they're present, but they're absentees because, they are from the wrong race and religion. So therefore, they're not allowed to return to their property, even though they live about 10 kilometers away from their property. But that property is then converted into Jewish settlements, and then people who are Jewish can go and live in that property. So with this one magical trick, about 75% of the land of Palestine became the property of the Israeli government. And it's owned by something called the Israeli Land Authority. So this is a very important point, which most people don't know. Particularly in libertarian circles, you'll hear a lot of talk about how Israel is a land of freedom and free markets. But Israel doesn't have a market in property. Israel has a socialist system for property ownership. Land is predominantly, about 93% of the land is owned by the Israeli Land Authority. And there is no market. You can't buy it, you can't own it, you can't sell it. You get to lease it, and you only get to lease it if you are Jewish. If you're not Jewish, you don't get to lease the land. The point is to try and get you to leave in any way whatsoever. So effectively, functionally, what is Zionism? What is the State of Israel? Functionally, if you want to think about it as an economic institution, it is a land theft agency with a military. And the military is funded by foreigners, particularly foreign goys. Europeans and Americans pay for it. And what that military does is that it steals the land of the Palestinian goyim. If you're a Palestinian and you're not Jewish, you get your land stolen by that military. The military steals the land, gives it to the Israeli Land Authority. And if anybody dissents, anybody objects, they get murdered. And that land is then granted to people from all over the world who claim to be Jewish. So if you've lived on that land for hundreds of years, for thousands of years, if you have property deeds on that land, but you're not Jewish, your property right doesn't count, and the military is there to take your land, and if you resist, they kill you. And then anybody from anywhere in the world can come and say, I am Jewish, and if they're Jewish, they get to be assigned that land, leased, not sold, because if they sell it, they might then go on and sell it to somebody who's not Jewish. So to ensure that the land remains Jewish, the land is always owned by the state, and so you can lease it from the government, and only, of course, if you are Jewish. And so, this is, there's this wonderful testament to this, this video that became viral a few years ago. If you check it out, I think it should be added to the Israeli national anthem. There was this American from Brooklyn called Yaakov who went to a home in Jerusalem. And he was walking into the house of a neighborhood, and he was telling the people in the house to get out. And he was beginning to bring in his stuff into their home and to kick them out. And they said, no, this is our home, don't kick us out. And he said, no, I'll get out. And they told him, no, you're stealing our house. He said, yeah, so what? If I don't steal it, somebody else is going to steal it. Why are you looking at me? And that, I think, should be the national anthem of Israel. This is what the country is about. It's a nation where the property of people there is just not considered valid because they're not Jewish. So therefore, everybody thinks it is okay. It's part of the normal functioning of life that you just go and you take the property and the land of people because they're not Jewish. Next one, please. So this was 1948, and then it continued after 1967 because Israel only managed to capture about 78% of Palestine in 1948, but there was another 22%, which is the West Bank and Gaza. And in 1967, Israel launched the war, and it captured those lands, and it brought into these lands the same system of property that it has in the rest of Palestine. And so anybody who was abroad, if you were abroad, your property was considered taken. You were absentee, and now property was taken by the Israeli government. And the Israeli government began to build Jewish-only settlements on these lands, and they've been building them for decades now, and they continue to build them and expand them more and more and more. And so they steal the land of the people who are not Jewish, and then they build settlements that are only open for people who are Jewish. You can't buy land there if you're not Jewish. You can't go live there if you're not Jewish. And they're constantly building those settlements and constantly taking over more land and restricting the movement of the people who are not Jewish in the West Bank. And so they've divided the West Bank now into three areas, Area A, B, and C. Area A is the one that is the most heavily concentrated in, next slide please. Area A is the one that is most heavily concentrated with Arab population. It's the dark or the light green or gray in the left slide. Areas B are the ones that are a little bit more, or a little less population concentration, so that's sort of joint Palestinian and Israeli control over the area. And then Area C, the majority is Israeli-owned, and Israeli government. The Israeli government controls it. And so they've restricted the movement of the people of the West Bank into smaller and smaller and smaller areas. And each one of these, they are all surrounded by barbed wire fence and walls and checkpoints. And so if you want to go from one to the other, you have to go through checkpoints. It takes hours to drive from some of these areas to one another. And now, just in the last couple of months, the Israeli government announced this is their plan now. They're going to take over the West Bank. All of the green areas are going to become part of Israel. The yellow areas are going to be left as Palestinian areas, and they're going to just basically lock up all of the Palestinians in those areas. And everybody who's in the green area, if you happen to live in the green area, you're losing your property rights. The Israeli government is going to take it over and it's going to register the property. So you see there's Jerusalem. It's between the two big yellow blobs. There's Jerusalem. Right south of it is Bethlehem. And Bethlehem is one of the areas that's just going to get taken over by Israel, almost all of it. And that means that the property of people there is just going to be confiscated. And this is, I just saw a tweet earlier today about it. They just announced to the people in those neighborhoods, you're going to be taken over. And so now you can't drive from one of those areas to the rest of the areas without getting a permit. So, 5-minute drive, now you need a permit from the Israeli government. And so this has just been this pattern from 1967, which is take more land and continuously steal the land and restrict the movement and the life of the people that live there. And of course, the really fascinating aspect of it here is that under the Israeli control of the West Bank, the people who are Jewish who live in the West Bank, who live in those settlements, they live under civil law. They have civil law, they have civil courts, and they are treated like normal citizens. Whereas the Palestinians live under military law. They're under military occupation. And military occupation is usually something that lasts for a few months or years, but eventually it gives way for civil law. But in the West Bank, we've had military law for 58 years now. And that's always been the ruling rule of the ruling law of the land. This is how it is. There's a military. And essentially, the lives of people who are not Jewish in the West Bank are dispensable. So in the civil laws in the West Bank essentially don't prosecute any crime against non-Jews. If you are an Israeli, and over the last few weeks there were several examples of Israelis murdering Palestinians with, cold blood, picks up a gun, shoots somebody, and it's on video, and the killer just walks away. There's no conviction, there's no charge, there's nothing. Even though the thing is on video, and Israelis will have caught it on video, and it's publicized, and you see it on Twitter, and many people see it. The person who kills a goyim does not face legal repercussions for it. It's not illegal, essentially, to kill people if they're not Jewish. So that's how the civil courts work for Jews in the West Bank, whereas for people who are not Jewish, you're living under military law, and it's the exact opposite. So a very, very tiny percentage of the crimes of the Jewish settlers against Palestinians is ever charged in court. And then among the ones that go to court, a very tiny percentage of them gets any kind of conviction. And then among the ones that get a conviction, a very tiny percentage will actually get any kind of punishment. And if they do get punishment, it will be some kind of symbolic slap on the wrist. On the other hand, the military court that rules over the Palestinians has a 99% conviction rate. And the only evidence needed for you to be convicted is just an Israeli soldier grabs you and puts you in jail, and then your life could be ruined. You could stay in jail for decades. You could stay under military administrative detention for months and years. Many people have spent years under administrative detention, essentially hostages. No charge, no criminal charges filed, but you stay in jail. And then if criminal charges are filed, then it's 99% conviction rate. There's no real judiciary process to speak of. It's just, well, the soldier says that he did something wrong. All right, then that's it. The soldier said so, so then you go to jail. And something like 1 million Palestinians have gone through that prison system over the past 58 years. Probably a majority of the people who live in Palestine have gone through that. Many child prisoners have gone there and been subject to torture. These prisons have incredible torture. People don't believe the torture stories because they can't believe that all of the image that we have about Israel would be similar to the Soviet gulags. But it is similar to the Soviet gulags. It makes the Soviet gulags look like a picnic. This is very well documented. The kind of abuse that they mete out to prisoners is absolutely horrendous. And you can see, if you have a legal system which says it's okay to murder someone, imagine how you're going to be treating them if you're a prison warden and they're your prisoner. You can only imagine how that works. So essentially, it is a military war on civilians. They're constantly confiscating land and property. It's almost impossible to obtain a permit to build on these areas. So the Palestinian areas where Palestinians live, it's impossible for them to get permits to build land. You're constantly refused to build land and to build homes. And if you build a home on your own land, it will get destroyed. And that's why more than 170,000 cases of housing demolitions done by the Israeli government against Palestinians since 1948. 170,000 homes destroyed. And that doesn't include the Gaza war. It doesn't include the things that have happened over the last 2 years. Just home demolition, actual state going and demolishing homes. Either it's punitive, you know somebody who did something bad, so we're going to destroy your home, or just simply, we want this land, so you can't build here, or we're going to take it. And they're constantly coming up with new and different excuses for why they need to take this land. And I think a very, very important point here is that all of this stuff is completely irrespective of what the Palestinians do. There is nothing that Palestinians can do that would allow them to keep their property rights. I think this is the key thing that people miss here. When people talk about it as being a conflict, it misses the point that one party is completely powerless to affect any kind of change into this kind of regime. You can't vote, you can't use your voice to demand anything, you can't expect anything. If you choose to peacefully resist, by speaking out against this, you're going to get your property taken and you're going to be expelled and you're going to be murdered or you're going to be placed in these cages in the West Bank. And if you choose to fight violently, you're going to have essentially a US military the power of the US military is being basically subjected through the Israeli military to this civilian population. So it's completely out of your hand. And the key thing is that the majority of Palestinian people have not done anything to resist this. The majority of Palestinian people have left, or they've not fought back, or they've been completely passive, completely peaceful about it. But it's a completely collectivist system where you are born with the sin of not being Jewish, and therefore you will constantly have your property taken, you will be murdered, you will be expelled, you will not have the right to own property, you will not have the right to build on your own property. And that's just immutable, nothing you can do to change it. Another one, please. And so, of course, here, I'd like to bring in Ludwig von Mises for his perspective on this issue. Ludwig von Mises, one of the most important concepts that I've learned from him and from Austrian economists in general is that human civilization, human society can only function with property. We either have property rights or we have conflict. And so, as Mises says, if human civilization, if history could teach us anything, it would be that private property is inextricably linked with civilization. Without property, there is no society. Where there is no private ownership of the means of production, there is no economy, but only conflict. And that's exactly what we see happening in Palestine. There is no system of private property, and therefore there is conflict. Just like we would expect to see anywhere in the world where there is no system of private property. You can't have social cooperation, you can't have peace, you can't have civilization unless people are able to own property. Next slide, please. So here, of course, one common misconception which Israeli propaganda helps propagate is this idea that, oh, well, the Middle East is just a blood-soaked region and people have always hated each other and they're always going to be killing each other and fighting, and that's just the way it is, and there's nothing you can do about it as Americans and Europeans except keep giving more money and weapons to Israel, of course. But this is complete nonsense. In fact, it's astonishing how much more peaceful the history of Palestine is compared to the last 80 years. Because for the past hundreds and thousands of years, Palestine has had a functioning system of property rights where people could own property and they could buy and sell property. And property rights were respected for people from all races and religions. So in 1850 or in 1350 or in 750, you could go and own and buy and sell land in Palestine under all the different governing structures that have existed, whether it was the Ottomans or whoever it was. You could own land regardless of your religion, regardless of your race, and society was able to understand the concept of property rights, where you own this land, therefore everybody around you respects that property rights. And consequently, we had a remarkably peaceful coexistence for 1,000, 2,000 years, since the Roman destruction of the temple. Basically, Palestine has been very peaceful. There have not been any major scale conflicts since then. Next one, please. In fact, this is, I came across this quote from a Polish rabbi. He is the brother-in-law of the founder of Hasidism, and he migrated to Palestine around 1749 or something like that, 1747. He migrated to Palestine, he moved to Palestine, and he was writing about his experiences there, going there and visiting the Jewish community in different cities in Palestine. And this is his experience in Hebron. Hebron is a city in the West Bank, which today is one of the worst places to live as a Palestinian, because there are a few thousand settlers, Israeli settlers, who live in the heart of the city. And they control the entire city. The entire city is turned into cages, and it could take you hours and hours of walking through cages and checkpoints to get from, to walk the distance of 1 kilometer from your work to your house if you're Palestinian. Now, Hebron is one of the absolute worst places, and the Israeli settlers are constantly abusing and murdering the Palestinians who live there. This is what it was like in 1747, 280 years ago, back when this guy visited. And he was explaining how friendly the relationships were between the Jewish community and the rest of the residents of the city. He was saying that even on the Shabbat, they close their area. Nobody enters their area. Nobody enters their courtyard. They can trust that their property will be left untouched. And indeed, you had a system where people had private property, and their private property was protected. And because their private property was protected, they were peaceful. So people celebrated together, and we had a peaceful coexistence. So this notion that this is just, oh, well, Muslims just hate Jews, and Jews just hate Muslims, or Christians hate Jews, and Jews hate Christians, and Muslims hate Jews and Christians, it's nonsense. We've always had coexistence between all of those people. You could be a Christian, you could be a Muslim, you could be a Jew in that land, and as long as you had property rights, you had peaceful coexistence, you had civilization, you had a society. Next slide, please. So it was, in fact, just Zionism that created the problem. It was not any kind of ethnic built-in racial animosity that people have. And this is just the normal thing that you would expect to see anywhere. Normal societies and states are built on a foundation of respecting property rights. The legitimacy of any government is derived from its respect and protection of property rights. The illegitimacy of Israel and the problem of Israel and the reason Israel is constantly living in conflict is because it is built on the denial of the existing property rights order. It has denied the property rights of something like 90% of the people who were living in the land when this stupid Zionist idea was first invented by the British. And that's why it's struggling to that's why it has to constantly be in violent struggle with everybody around it. And you know, people here would like to make the analogy with the West. Well, you know, the Americans stole America from the Native Americans, or Canada, or Australia, or New Zealand. And that's not true. It is not an accurate analogy for it, because when Europeans arrived in North America and Australia, there was no existing system of property rights. For the largest part, land was not privately owned. And so it was possible for the natives and for Europeans to to go to unowned land and homestead that land. So it is legitimate property. It is legitimate for any person to take an unowned land, an unclaimed land, and fence it and claim that it is his property. And European settlers in those areas, for the most part, they settled on unowned land. There was no private property system where they had to expel people at gunpoint to take their land. At least initially, they settled on unowned land, and then conflict emerged between them. But the extent of conflict between Native Americans and whites obviously has been massively blown out of proportion over the last century as part of the continuous, propaganda against white people and against colonialism and all of those stuff. But it is a completely different perspective. And I think, of course, the pro-Israel propagandists like to emphasize this because it helps them trying to claim that Israel is similar to this. But it is nothing like it. In Israel, you had a system of property rights. You had land deeds. And you had the Jewish settlers who came from Europe in the 1920s and earlier, they could purchase property. The system of property existed. When they got off the Mayflower in the U.S., in what is today the United States of America, they couldn't buy land. There was no land to buy. There was no system of buying and selling land. Eventually, these things were developed. But that, for me, helps us explain the illegitimacy and the need for constant subsidies for the Zionist project. So that's why Zionism effectively can only be sustained as a tiny state, parasitic on much larger civilized societies that have property rights. So that's why, Senegal, Greece, South Korea, Brazil, all of these countries, in order for them to exist, all they have to do is just recognize the property rights of the people that are living there. And they exist as countries. That's why, nobody goes around and telling you have to respect the right of Brazil to exist. Brazil is just an administrative unit for protecting the property rights of people who exist there. Israel, on the other hand, is a system of theft that requires to be constantly violating the property rights, and that's why it needs massive subsidies from the West. That's why it needs to be constantly supported by the West. And in fact, it wouldn't have existed had it not been for European and American and Soviet support. If you look through the history of the Zionist project, initially it was the British who came up with it. And then in the 1930s, and this is not well known, but in the 1930s, the crucial thing for the survival of the Zionist project in the 1930s, when there was growing Arab hostility and when there was growing British hostility as well, when the British started getting second thoughts about it, what was crucial for the survival of this project was Nazism, because Nazism wanted to expel Jews from Germany, and they signed an agreement with the Zionists that they would send the Jews of Germany to Palestine in order to support Zionist settlement, because that worked to get Jews out of Europe. And then the Soviet Union, of course, supported it a lot because it was a communist socialist initially idea, where they had all these socialist ideas for land ownership, which still dominate today. Land is still owned in a socialist way, so you can understand why the socialists and the Soviets supported it. And then since the 1960s, when the Israeli takeover of the US government, Israel has been completely dependent on US subsidies and support. So it's constantly surviving thanks to foreign fiat, thanks to foreign governments' inflation, producing money, using that money to go and support and subsidize the existence of the Israeli state. And so we've had hundreds of billions of dollars from the US only to Israel, something more than $400 billion as aid from the US to Israel, dwarfing every other country. You know, people talk about aid, you know, they usually think of all these African poor countries with rich presidents taking money. All of that is dwarfed by what Israel receives. Israel receives far more aid than anything. Israel received about $100 billion of aid from Germany under the pretext of Holocaust reparations, which mostly goes to the Israeli government rather than any kind of actual survivors. And you've had, on top of that, of course, you've had trillions of dollars spent by the Western governments on fighting wars against Israel's enemies, which serve no purpose for these governments. You know, Israel is the only reason the US was fighting Iraq or fighting Libya or is fighting Iran now. All of these regime change wars, all of the Middle Eastern wars primarily serve the interest of Israel, and that's cost trillions of dollars. And you know, you can see the effort that Israelis did in order to promote those wars, the project for the new American century. If you're interested, read more and more about it. And it even gets to the point where it now requires, you know, the suspension of basic civil liberties and basic civil rights and free speech in places like Germany and in the US in order to continue to make sure that this subsidy, this support, these tens and hundreds of billions of dollars continue to be taken away from American and German and European citizens in order to be given to Israel so that it can continue to violate property rights, so that it can continue to have a land agency with a military that is constantly stealing property rights. Thank you very much.